Since the advent of civilization, summarizes Lewis Morgan, the outgrowth of property has been so immense, its forms so diversified, its uses so expanding, and its management so intelligent in the interests of its owners, that it has become, on the part of the people, an unmanageable power. The human mind stands bewildered in the presence of its own creation. The time will come, nevertheless, when human intelligence will rise to the mastery over property and define the relations of the state to the property it protects, as well as the obligations and the limits of the rights of its owners. The interests of society are paramount to the individual interests, and the two must be brought into just and harmonious relations. A mere property career is not the final destiny of mankind, if progress is to be the law of the future as it has been of the past. The time which has passed away since civilization began is but a fragment of the past duration of man's existence, and but a fragment of the ages to come. The dissolution of society bids fair to become the termination of a career of which property is the end and aim, because such a career contains the elements of self-destruction. Democracy in government, brotherhood in society, equality in rights and privileges, and universal education foreshadows the next higher plane of society, to which experience, intelligence, and knowledge are steadily tending. It will be a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gentes." Unquote. In the meantime, we forge a social body that expresses our indignation at being treated like matter doesn't matter, like mother doesn't count, like fathers made of paper, like brothers too brief to bother with, like sisters too grieved to be believed. Fuck death in the ass and all its minions who bury the living and call it a day. Business involves the strategic placement of busy bodies. Busy, cognate with German besisch, occupied. Occupied, cognate with Latin ob cupio, to want badly, cognate also with Latin ob capio, to seize, to capture, to captain. Business began with occupying. The first large-scale business involved occupying nations in order to ensure tribute by organizing prisoners into a workforce. The occupation army never withdrew. After the ranks were opened up to ambitious prisoners never stopped enlisting. I'd rather live beyond the pale than on it. Beyond the picket fence, the picket town. Inasmuch as a workforce is considered a force of nature, to be collected, stored, expended, and reconstituted at the will of a class of operators of the workforce, and not a human force, itself made up of operators voluntarily associated to accomplish a task, wage labor abuses human life. How impossible then, for instance, the function of the word possess appears, writes Robert Musil, when one applies it to lovers. But does it reveal wishes of a finer sort, to want to possess principles and the respect of one's children, ideas, oneself? This unwieldy movement of attack, as though on the part of some ponderous animal that crushes its prey with its entire weight, is nevertheless quite justifiably the fundamental and favorite expression of capitalism. And in it there can be seen the connection between those who have property and possessions in bourgeois life and those who are the owners of knowledge and skills. For that is what bourgeois life has made of its thinkers and artists, while love and asceticism stand to one side, brother and sister, a solitary pair. And are this brother and sister not, when they stand together without any aim or target, in contrast with life, which is all aims and targets? But the words aim and target come from the language of gunmen. So do not aimless and targetless, in their original context, signify as much as not being one who kills? So, through the mere act of following up the track that language leaves behind, a blurred but revealing trail, one stumbles upon the way that everywhere the crudely altered meaning has pushed into the place of more circumspect relationships, which are now quite lost." Unquote. Responding to Musil's suggestion, let me follow up the etymological track that the word work, W-O-R-K, leaves behind. According to Indo-European laws of sound change, work mutates via vork to Vulcan, to falcon, to folk. Work is cognate with, that is, related to the meaning of folk. The folk do the work. They suffer the pain of exertion. Old Saxon, verk, means pain. Work, folk, also cognate with Sanskrit vrij, which means to twist off, wring or wrench off, pull off, pluck, gather. This reads like a job description. Related to vrig is Sanskrit vrik, which means to cut down or cut off or cut asunder, to cleave, to hew, to fell a tree. Like the folk, the wolf, cognate with vrika, tears, twists. Derivative vri or bri means to tear, to pluck up roots. The workforce, the work folk, fork. They split things in two. They forge. They fabricate metal. The W of work, the F of fork, fall away, yielding org, Greek organon, an instrument, implement, tool for making or doing. Organization, the result of using the tool. In Latin, work appears as verg with an E. Vergo means bend, turn, incline, verge on. A verge is something that borders, limits, or bounds. On the verge of, on the folk of. Also cognate with work is Sanskrit vragami, whence English fragment, fracture. Folk work, breaking into pieces. Folk art, shaping a social body on the wheel of revolution. A footnote in Marx's Capital reads, "Investment capital is said by a quarterly reviewer to fly turbulence and strife, and to be timid, which is very true. But this is very incompletely stating the question. Capital eschews no profit or very small profit, just as nature was formerly said to abhor a vacuum. With adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure its employment anywhere. 20% will produce eagerness. 50% positive audacity. 100% will make it ready to trample on all human laws. 300%, and there is not a crime at which it will scruple, not a risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. If turbulence and strife will bring a profit, it will freely encourage both. Smuggling and the slave trade amply proved all that is here stated." Unquote. Anniversary. Margaret dear, let's engineer another year. Share it between us like a genital. I've condensed the following quote from Capital in order to clarify Marx's theory of surplus value. Simply stated, the theory is this, that the worker's surplus labor, that is, the labor demanded by his boss beyond that required for the worker to earn enough money to survive, is the basis of his boss's profit. Quote, "Let us take a peasant liable to do compulsory service for his lord. He works on his own land with his own means of production for, say, 3 days a week. Then 3 other days he does forced work on the lord's domain. If one fine morning the lord appropriates to himself the land, the cattle, the seed, in a word, the means of production of this peasant, the latter will thenceforth be obliged to sell his labor power to his lord. He will labor 6 days a week as before, 3 for himself, 3 for his lord, who thenceforth becomes a wage-paying capitalist." As we fuck, the more desperate I become to crush the goddess shining in your eyes, lest she escape and kill me, dying to reach her. You'll see what these two themes have in common soon. Note: to avoid confusion, one should keep in mind the distinction between labor value and market value. The surplus labor value added to a commodity is a function of work time. This unpaid work time hidden in the commodity makes profit possible. The market value, on the other hand, which depends on various factors like the demand for the product, competition, etc., determines how much the profit is worth in dollars and cents, or if it is worth anything at all. For if there is no demand for the product, the surplus labor value invested in the product has no market value, or even less than none. That is, the owner takes a loss. Let's continue Marx's example. The peasant works 6 days a week, 3 days to provide subsistence, without which he cannot survive, and 3 days of forced labor for his lord, without which his lord cannot survive without working. If the peasant works 10 hours a day, then, excluding Sunday, he works 60 hours a week, 30 hours of work to provide for his subsistence, and 30 hours to provide for his lords. Hence, half the value he creates is for himself to live on, and half the value goes to his lord. So every day, the peasant works 5 hours for himself and 5 hours for his lord. If the peasant requires, say, $30 a week to survive, and he adds that amount of value to the product after working 30 hours, and he knows he adds that amount of value because after 30 hours of labor has been invested in it, the product has a market value of $35, or $30 less $5, which represents the value added to the product of the raw material, if any, consumed in creating the product, and of wear and tear of the tools, that is, less that portion of the lord's investment added to the product in the course of 30 hours of labor. Then, the value of the peasant's labor power is rated at $1 an hour for the first 30 hours and $0 an hour, here's where the profit comes from, for the second 30 hours. Hence, the worklord agrees to pay 50 cents an hour for 60 hours of work a week. Take it or leave it. Naturally, we take it because we need the work, as we say, who were born being robbed, grew up being robbed, and after robbing a few times and feeling bad about it, surrender to a life of victimization, that is, become proletarian. Then the peasant, the vagabond, the rascal, the maverick, the recidivist, the junkie, the soul, the self, the insurrectionist, the revolutionary, is able to work 60 hours a week while living on $30 a week. Or in other words, he is able to create $60 or twice as much value as he receives. Now, if all the worklords have agreed to pay their hired help subsistence wages, that is, in this case 50 cents an hour, then the worker who wishes to survive, even if just barely, has no choice but to kick back half the value he creates. In short, the class of worklords extorts profit from the class of workhorses as ruthlessly, never mind if you fuck your boss or love your work, as routinely as a gang of thieves exacts daily tribute from its victims. Except with this difference, that the work thieves own the town, own the state, own the nation, own the fucking planet and everyone on it, the outside of everyone, that is, not the inside, where we live and commune and plan and organize an excursion, and hence operate within the law, since they make the law to suit themselves. That is, their so-called sacred contract merely sanctifies rake-off. So, fuckhead, you can stop blaming the Jews and the Gypsies and the blacks and the browns and the Nazis and the rednecks and the Arabs for the headache you can't shake, and stop blaming the kids and the dogs and the cats and global warming and cancer and overpop and underworld and the Senate and Uncle Sam and Aunt Rose and spouses and friends and the CIA and the IRS. Because if there is one fucking unconditioned, unbrainwashed place left, never mind in your head or your heart, which rotted out centuries ago, but in your hands with which you work, the pair of quints you screw onto your will every morning, ask them who built everything that if the left hand is one person and the right hand is another, shouldn't they work together and share equally the wealth of the body, the common wealth? Karl Marx summarizes his theory of surplus value. You like boxing, huh? Well, this is the theory that KO'd capitalism, whatever you think of Marx the bully, Marx the manipulator, as follows. Quote, if one day's work were necessary in order to keep one worker alive for one day, on the subsistence he buys with his earnings, then capital would not exist, because the working day would exchange for its own product, that is, the value of the product would equal the worker's earnings. So that capital, that is, ownership of the profit or surplus value, could not realize itself and hence could not maintain itself as capital. If, however, only half a workday is necessary to keep one worker alive one whole day, then the surplus value of the product, that is, the kickback to the worklord, is self-evident, because the capitalist has paid the price of only half a working day, but has obtained a whole day's value objectified in the product, thus has exchanged nothing for the second half of the workday. The matter can also be expressed this way. If the worker needs only half a working day in order to live a whole day, then in order to keep alive as a worker, he needs to work only half a day. The second half of the labor day is forced labor, surplus labor, unquote. Forced, 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 forced. Feel the stress? Under pressure? Forced, 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 forced labor, forest labor. Can't see the woods till the trees uproot and chop down the sawmill. Don't cathect the bosses. They don't mean shit. Go for the saw blade. The idea, the very idea of capitalism is the villain. Decapitate capitalism, and the capitalists will run around like chickens without heads. First union sexual. Last union sexual. Meanwhile, the Teamsters. People who fuck together luck together. They're locked together to luck together. Employer. Since we used up your work power, here, we'll replenish it, offers a paycheck. Employee. How much did you use? Employer. A week's worth. Employee. No, I mean, what amount of value did we add to the finished product? Employer. How the hell should I know? Employee. Well, since the means of production, raw material, machinery, plant, etc., merely transfer their value to the product without creating new value, then the surplus value or profit must comprise the new value which we added to the finished product. That's what we're worth. We want it, minus a fee to you for having provided the opportunity to earn it. Employer. You're fired. Henceforth you are trespassing. Mary, call the police. Mary. What amount of value do I add to the product if I do? Employer. You're fired. Hello, police? Some trespassers won't leave the premises. Police. What amount of value do we add to the product if we respond? Suppose a modern worker has to work 3 hours a day in order to pay for his or her daily expenses. If the worker works 6 hours, the 3 hours worked beyond the time which covers his or her subsistence is surplus labor, the source of the capitalist profit, which the worker has no choice but to deposit in the bank of capitalism for investment in the business of capitalism. Hence, the workforce collectively owns capitalism and all the wealth produced by capitalism. Therefore, although individual workers are the victims of the theft, only the collective workforce has the right or the power to disarm the international ring of work thieves and to redistribute the plunder among the victims. And that is what revolution is about. Revolution is simply the act of repossession on the part of the workforce of its own property, and of the equal redistribution of that property among the original class of possessors. Let not your heart harden like green cement, but let it alternately stiffen and slacken like genitalia until conviction comes. Quote, as capitalist, writes Marx, he is only capital personified. His soul is the soul of capital. But capital has one single life impulse, the tendency to create value and surplus value, to make its constant factor, the means of production, absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. Capital is dead labor, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. The time during which the laborer works is the time during which the capitalist consumes the labor power he has purchased from him. Unquote. Revolution is to Marx's theory of class struggle what lightning is to Dr. Frankenstein's monster. Revolt generates the voltage required to bring the proletariat class to life. At first, the rights of property, Marx explains, seem to us to be based on a man's own labor. At least some such assumption was necessary, since only commodity owners with equal rights, that is, buyers and sellers, confronted each other, and the sole means by which a man could become possessed of the commodities of others, according to the theory of exchange by equals, was by alienating, that is, putting into the possession of another, his own commodities, and these could be replaced by labor alone. Now, however, property turns out to be the right on the part of the capitalist to appropriate the unpaid labor of others, or its product, and to be the impossibility on the part of the laborer of appropriating his own product. The separation of property from labor has become the necessary consequence of a law that apparently originated in their identity, that is, the law that to the owner of the labor belongs the fruit of the labor. But under capitalism, the owner of capital enjoys the right of leasing labor, that is, as acting as temporary owner of the labor, of pretending, in other words, that he did not work, and hence to him or not, and not to the actual performer of the labor, belongs the fruit of the labor. Unquote. Profit arises, then, from the purchase and sale of labor power, from the purchase of labor power in the form of employment, from the sale of labor power in the form of the products produced by labor or the services performed by it. But capital will not purchase labor power unless it extorts, on threat of excluding the worker from participating in the labor market, which, with brief interruptions when labor is scarce, has been cornered, has been monopolized by capital, extorts from the worker an agreement to systematically donate a portion of his or her work time to capital. From this extracted work time, profit arises. Profit, claims Marx, is the tribute annually exacted from the working class by the capitalist class, unquote. How can we fuck if we become one? At best, only masturbate. Let's stay close, but two. The higher the pressure, the hotter the parts. Sexual community, writes Kant, is the reciprocal use made by one person of the sexual organs and faculties of another. Marriage is the union of two people of different sexes with a view to the mutual possession of each other's sexual attributes, unquote. Quote, with these there developed the division of labor, writes Marx, which was originally nothing but the division of labor in the sexual act, unquote. Only the proletariat cares enough about fucking to remake the world in the image of a couple copulating. Let me illustrate. I'm jacking off, you're jacking off. If you agree to offer the service of your cunt in place of my hand, I'll extend to you the use of my dick in place of your finger. Is it a deal? Now, so long as I masturbate, my labor divides into hand and genital. And since the source of the pleasure lies in my genital, that is, without a genital, I wouldn't feel sexual pleasure no matter how many hands I possessed. With respect to producing sexual pleasure, I consider my hand subordinate to my genital. And since the same argument applies to you, that is, without your cunt, which is the source of your pleasure, 100 fingers would have no power to stimulate you, then your finger is likewise subordinate to your genital. When we fuck, however, from your point of view, my dick gratuitously relieves your finger of the burden of stimulating you. Likewise, from my point of view, your cunt relieves my hand of an analogous burden. My dick saves you work. Your cunt returns the favor. Now, the source of your pleasure remains your cunt, not my dick, which merely substitutes for your finger. So, structurally speaking, hierarchy continues. What I mean is that my penis as instrument or tool is a subordinate means to the end of stimulating you. But what from your point of view is mere customized, streamlined finger, from my point of view is the very vessel of my pleasure, seeking the instrumentality of your, to me, cunty hand, to me, handy cunt. My dick to you, dicky digit, to you, digital dick. My end is your means. Your end is my means. My first is your second. My second is your first. In the case of fucking, then, equality does not dissolve hierarchy. And this is such an extremely important point when we consider that the major force of anarchic critique is to dissolve hierarchy. It's such a little more complicated than that. In the case of fucking, then, equality does not dissolve hierarchy so much as reciprocate it. My boss works for you more satisfactorily than does your employee, as does your boss outmode my own employee. Consequently, having terminated the service of our employees, we free them to pursue their own respective leisure activities during the duration of our union. Now let us consider our mutual or collective point of view. The more my dick acts like a finger, the more my dick feels like a dick. No. The more my dick acts like your finger, the more it feels like my dick. Same with your cunt. The more it acts like my hand, the more it feels like your cunt. This mutual reciprocity is the basis of our solidarity. Fucking also serves as a paradigm of the labor of love versus work. The work, the energy expended in fucking, is repaid. The workers receive their reward during the very act of labor. There is no lag between work and payment. Thus, the labor involved in fucking satisfies a criterion of the labor of love, namely, that gratification, however much it may be prolonged, not be postponed until some later date, but concur concomitantly with the effort. The more intensive the labor, the intenser the pleasure. Work, however necessary, which does not satisfy this criterion, cannot but degrade the worker, since he or she acts the part of a tool instead of a person. Therefore, if the job cannot be automated, let it be designated as degrading, as not ideal work, and let all of us pitch in, consciously sacrificing the advantage arising from the division of labor in favor of the pleasure that comes from helping out a friend. And so even dirty work will move an inch or two closer toward the work of love. I'm trying to prove here that fucking sets a standard for labor which, in a less abusive atmosphere than that of capitalism, which fears the egalitarian implications of sex, would be routinely espoused as a worthwhile ideal. Shit, we could have a copulating couple on the flag, for Christ's sake. Espoused as a worthwhile ideal rather than ridiculed and... let me start that again. I'm trying to prove here that fucking sets a standard for labor, which in a less abusive atmosphere than that of capitalism, which fears the egalitarian implications of sex, would be routinely espoused as a worthwhile ideal, rather than ridiculed and denigrated. For example, a hard-on is a tool for fucking. The labor expended in producing a hard-on is indistinguishable from the satisfaction derived from the work. Here, as in all labor of love, work and reward happen together, like breathing. All right, capital sex. The genital yields satisfaction if labor is applied to it, but unlike proletarian sex, although the workers possess the means of erotic production, they do not own them. The owner of the genital is different from the possessor of it. When the owner desires to produce sexual pleasure in order to commodify it and sell it on the market, he hires workers to apply their labor to their genitals. The mounting of erotic pleasure, however, is strictly supervised. Routinely diverted and transformed like electrical energy and stored in a battery, the erotic pleasure is accumulated abstractly in a genital account. The workers fuck without pleasure. At scheduled intervals, however, they receive small jolts of erotic pleasure, less the pleasure to which the owner of the genital is legally entitled. Neither the workers nor the owner experience orgasm. The workers because the pleasure is insufficient. The owner because the pleasure is commodified and sold. In proletarian sex, the exchange of value between the participants, who are in business for themselves, is equivalent. In capital sex, a third party, the owner of the genitals, intervenes and retains a portion of the pleasure, the surplus value, produced by the workers. A surplus is possible because the fuckers produce more pleasure during a work shift than is necessary to mask the otherwise painful exertion of sexual labor. Hence, capitalism rips off humanity's dream of abundance, sufficient to fund an era of universal leisure, which is epitomized by the superplus of sexual pleasure, much more pleasure than is needed to mask the muscular strain. Note: I once awoke from sleep ejaculating. Since the pleasure-producing part of my brain, lovely Venus, was still asleep, I experienced the violent muscular spasms involved in hurling sperm a distance of 4 or 5 penis lengths across a bed. So I concluded that sexual pleasure anesthetizes the pain caused by the muscular spasms, at least in the male, necessary to produce an orgasm.